The FTC Safeguards Rule came about in 2003, and the whole idea of it was to really require financial institutions, and that includes dealers, to come up with a comprehensive written information security program, a program that explains how they're going to protect customer information so it does not fall into the hands of an identity thief. It has 5 elements. At the time, they said you have to have a program coordinator that oversees the program. You have to do a risk assessment. What are the risks to your customer information? You have to come up with adequate safeguards to control against those risks, and you have to regularly audit them. You also have to oversee your service providers. Those are companies that have access to your customer information. And also, you have to periodically adjust your program in light of changing circumstances. So that is how the FTC Safeguards Rule has been structured since 2003. A hallmark of it, however, was that it was always flexible. You had to meet those 5 elements, but the FTC recognized that you have companies that are large and small. You have those that handle a ton of information, those that handle very little information. None of their circumstances are the same. So whereas you have to fulfill each element of the requirement, how you get there would depend on your circumstances. Now, regrettably, the FTC has really moved much more to a one-size-fits-all approach. What they're doing now is they're saying you still have to meet the 5 elements. However, you also have to meet a series of technological minimums, regardless of your size, regardless of your circumstances. And therein lies the challenge. The big picture for dealers on this, in a couple of phrases, is first, it affects all of them. A lot of issues we talk about affect a subset of automobile dealers. This affects all automobile dealers. So everyone is going to have to engage in activity to make sure that what we're going to describe here becomes a reality. Second, it is very involved. Sometimes we talk about a new notice requirement. Sometimes we say you have to save a new record, you have to retain it. This is so much more. This is a comprehensive process. You're having to really go through and figure out, how am I going to prevent my information on my customers falling into the hands of an identity thief, consistent with the way the requirements are laid out by the Federal Trade Commission. And there's a lot to that. The other challenge here is when you have to come into compliance. It's December 9th of this year, and there's a lot to do between now and then. So it's quite the undertaking. It's going to be very involved. And again, the time to get there is quite limited. So the first thing dealers really need to do to come into compliance is they have to look at 2 components of this: what they have to do in-house and really what they have to do with their vendors, with their service providers. Now, the program requirement is that you have this written program, which dealers have to do today, but now it has all these added elements. So dealers are going to have to make sure by December 9th they have a written program that reflects all the new elements, that incorporates them into their new written information security program. And that is going to require some work. Now, fortunately, we have a product to help dealers with that. We have a sample program that dealers can use as a starting point to try to get to the completion of that written program requirement. With regard to service providers, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. Service providers, in many cases, actually control dealers' information. So dealers are going to have to make sure when you select them, and this has always been the case, you exercise due diligence in making sure the service providers that you select are capable of putting adequate controls in place to protect the customer information you have entrusted to them. In addition, dealers have to make sure their written contract with their service providers requires the service provider to protect that information. It's not enough simply to get a letter from a CEO or some other professional with a service provider that says, yes, we're going to protect the information. It needs to be in the contract. In addition, dealers need to monitor their protection of the information. So there's actually an active component here. It's not simply entering into a contractual provision or even selecting them in the first instance. On a go-forward basis, they need to make sure that there's a degree of monitoring where they're making sure that this information is still protected. Because at the end of the day, it's the dealer who's responsible for any breach, whether it's something that the dealer directly controls or is controlled by their service provider. So dealers are going to have to exercise a lot of oversight, and it's also required by the rule. So in terms of the technological minimums that dealers now have to satisfy, and really any financial institution has to satisfy, there are a multitude of them. I can hit on a couple. First of all, we've always talked about a program coordinator that needs to be in charge. That person is now defined as a qualified individual, and that person has to report annually to the board of directors on the status of the program. That annual reporting requirement was not required previously. They also have to put in place things that many of us are familiar with, such as encryption. You have to encrypt your information not only in transit, but also at rest at the dealership. Many vendors today do not do that. They do not encrypt information that is maintained within the dealership, and that needs to change. Multi-factor authentication. If you're going to access information, you're going to have to satisfy multi-factor authentication steps. And again, many people are familiar with those because that's required in many other contexts. Access controls, system logs, penetration testing. Penetration testing is where actually you have to try to penetrate your information security system to see if there's vulnerabilities, if you can get within it, and if so, you need to plug the gaps. There's also a new requirement, and by the way, these are just examples. They are far more numerous than what we're covering here, where you have to have an incident response plan if you have a security event. And that can be more than just a security breach. So what we're looking at here is a written program, information security plan, where you explain if there is an event, here is how we will respond. So you have to have the comprehensive written program like you always have, and then a component of that is going to have to be a written information security plan. So that becomes critical. This has been issued, and really when you look at the individual steps, there's nothing negative about them per se. The type of things that are laid out here, certainly in good faith, are intended to protect customer information. The challenge is, as with other federal regulatory requirements, these are all unfunded mandates. In other words, a business is told you have to do A through Z, they're provided no funding for it. Now again, some requirements are fairly straightforward. There's going to be some cost involved, but it's not huge. This one involves an awful lot of cost. We did studies on that. Dealers can be prepared to really have to spend a lot of money, invest a lot of resources to try to get this to the point where they have met the requirements of the Safeguards Rule. So this will be a big lift. We should first point out, if you have a security breach separate and apart from this rule, it can really result in adverse consequences for the dealership. You would have affected customers, and there is really the possibility of actions being brought against the dealership because they would have been viewed as negligent in their duty to protect information. So that threat is always out there with or without the Safeguards Rule. With regard to a violation of one of these requirements, most likely what you could expect would be an FTC enforcement action, which would be administrative. You could have it from your state attorney general, or you could have a lawsuit in state court. There's not a federal right of action, but in state court because you violated a federal consumer protection standard. That could be construed as an unfair, deceptive act or practice. What does that mean? It means you can end up in court. It would be in a state court, and all the consequences that flow from such an action could certainly stick to the dealership. So this rule actually came out, and we immediately published some frequently asked questions that are available at nata.org/safeguardsrule. And that's really just a general orientation to here's what just happened, and this is what you can expect. We then followed up with a webinar. We had an NADA show workshop, and most significantly, we did a comprehensive rewrite to our FTC Safeguards Rule guide. So it talks about everything that's required, both under the original rule and the amended rule. It's all packaged together, and we have an appendix, which is a template, a sample written program for dealers to use as a starting point to put together the written program they are required to adopt. We also have on our website other resources that are available to dealers.